Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to a preview of perhaps the second most intriguing game after the Monday Nighter this weekend on Super Wildcard Weekend. There is a ton to talk about, so let's get into it. We've got two of the highest pure talent NFL quarterbacks going at it in round one, which is truly a rare treat. And don't forget to watch until the end of the video because there's going to be some gambling tips and angles that you might want to watch for on Saturday night. Let's just set the stage really quickly by talking about what happened in week 3 between these two teams. They obviously aren't division opponents, so they only met once this season. The result was actually, without a doubt, the worst performance overall by the Chargers this season. They lost the game at home 38-10, and although the score would indicate a complete, thorough shellacking by the Jaguars, that's not necessarily exactly what happened. In the second half, the Chargers were dominated. There's no doubt about it. There were a lot of reasons why, which we'll get into, but the first half of this game was actually extraordinarily competitive. And the overall, I think, key thing to draw from that matchup is that most of it can be thrown out. Why do I say that? The reason being, the Chargers are a vastly different team now than they were then, both in terms of personnel and the ability to execute their defensive scheme. And the Jaguars are as well. The Jaguars are an extremely young team. Their ability defensively in that game, although they did a really good job against Justin Herbert, they are a much better defensive team now than they were then. They've made a tremendous number of improvements. And Trevor Lawrence is now better equipped to execute in a wider variety of ways against a wider variety of coverages than he was when these two teams clashed in week 3. One of the things that we can definitely draw from that first matchup is that the Chargers, if they try and fail to get pressure on Trevor Lawrence, they're in big trouble. Trevor Lawrence was in a situation where Doug Peterson clearly prepared him extremely well in that first matchup for the Chargers to try to blitz him on a consistent basis because he was able to execute his quick game, the part of the NFL experience that Mac Jones seems to hate so much this season.
And that speaks volumes, and they better figure this out because they got a pretty good, decent football team. Yeah, you see it right there. You see the cuss words come out. But
the quick game for Trevor Lawrence in that first matchup, especially in the second half, was dominant. They were able to get consistent chunk plays when the Chargers tried to get pressure. That tells you that Doug Peterson was anticipating Staley's game plan in that game to be very pressure heavy, and he was correct. Trevor Lawrence was well prepared there, and that was one of the few times all season, for sure, that Brandon Staley came up with a game plan defensively and a play calling schema defensively that really didn't work out. Since then, Staley's done actually a phenomenal job in multiple games, and we'll get into that with his game planning and play calling. But in this particular game, his game plan was very pressure heavy, and it was clear early on that Doug Peterson had a good counter for it, and unfortunately, Staley, who was actually limited, to be fair, by a lack of personnel and injuries that happened throughout that game, did not adjust his game plan at all. I expect Staley to come up with a much more effective and diverse game plan this time around for a couple of reasons. One, he has much better depth of personnel available to him this time around. Number 2, he has the lessons of the first matchup to learn from. And number 3, his team is much more used to playing with each other. They're used to executing the scheme and the system that Staley wants to play now that they've played together for such a long time compared to week 3 when they were relatively green by comparison. The two key elements that are most likely to decide this game on the surface are 1, the coaching matchup, and 2, the quarterback matchup. And obviously it's easy to say the quarterback matchup because at the end of the day, it is the most important individual position in team sports, and these teams are both, although they have very spunky, fast defenses, the length of both of their playoff runs is more than likely going to be decided by how far each of their young quarterbacks can carry them. So let's start by diving into coaching. Doug Peterson has done, I think, an unequivocally great job with the primary reason that he was hired, which was to develop Trevor Lawrence in a way that Urban Meyer proved himself hilariously incapable of doing last year. Trevor Lawrence basically didn't have a rookie season in terms of tutelage and understanding what it takes to win in the NFL at a high level. He basically just went through his rookie season feeling around in the dark and trying to improve without much coaching. But now he's come in and he's gotten a guy as his head coach, which was a very good hire by Shad Khan, by the way, the owner of the Jaguars. He put Trevor Lawrence in a situation to learn from a former quarterback who clearly understands the important elements of what it takes to develop a young quarterback and even to succeed, as we saw with Nick Foles, without a quarterback who's top tier. He now has a quarterback who's top tier in this particular situation in Jacksonville. And Lawrence certainly wasn't all that spectacular during their losing streak earlier in the season, but he's shown tremendous growth, although he wasn't perfect last week. And so you know that in terms of an offensive game plan, it is very likely that Lawrence will have a good idea of what he's going to see in terms of pressure packages, where the blitzers are going to come from, what the Chargers scheme is likely going to look like out of the gate. Peterson's done a really, really good job offensive game planning this year. And so that's going to be a unique challenge for Staley to both counter or try to counter a very dynamic offense with good playmakers, and also to have to match wits with a guy who has gone on a playoff run before with lesser raw materials at the quarterback position. So it's going to be very interesting to see those two match wits. Now, flipping the coin to the other side and looking at the Chargers, Staley was outcoached by Peterson the first time around. I think it's pretty fair to say. However, since then, Staley has done exactly what you want as a franchise when you hire a head coach with a specific level of expertise, either offensively or defensively. What do I mean by that? When you hire a guy with the level of reputation that Staley had for his work with the LA Rams on defense, you want him to be able to elevate the defense that you have as a head coach to a level above what it would otherwise be. In other words, you want the defense to be playing a scheme effectively to the point that it makes said defense better than the sum of its parts. And we've seen that with the Chargers, especially in the second half of the year this year. One of the things that they really need to do is disrupt the Evan Ingram, Trevor Lawrence connection, which has been central to a lot of the things that the Jaguars have done exceedingly well offensively in the past few weeks. So if they put Derwin James on Evan Ingram in a sort of shadow role in a way that he's done against Travis Kelce a couple of times this year, that I think is a very potentially profitable defensive strategy from Staley's perspective, because if they take Ingram away or they take a lot of Ingram's productivity away, that could be something that makes the Jaguars offense much less multidimensional, which is of course the goal. And in terms of strategic keys to the game from the Jaguars perspective, one of the things that the Jaguars I think need to focus on offense is targeting the Chargers out of 11 personnel, which means one running back, one tight end, 3 wide receivers. Etienne has actually been excellent. Has 99 carries, 615 yards from that personnel package this season, 6.2 yards a carry, which is tremendous. And the Chargers defense has actually surrendered 5.4 yards per carry against that package this season. It's a package that the Jaguars strayed away from last week against Tennessee, which is obviously understandable. Different matchups call for different usages of different personnel, but it is one that I think Doug Peterson should focus on, specifically because the Chargers have, against teams that don't have malleable rushing game plans, in other words, teams that are likely to do the same thing over and over because it usually works, Staley has found ways over the course of the season to counter what teams like San Francisco have done really, really well. Tennessee, same thing. The Chargers had really good success against those two teams, both of which are brilliant rushing teams. So the Jaguars need to be a bit creative to create the running game success that I think they're going to need to win this game. And the other thing, of course, is the obvious, which is Keenan Allen is an absolute assassin for the Chargers on third down, and Jacksonville has to account for that. One of the things that is so devastating about Mike Williams being out is that on third down, if Williams is on the field, Jacksonville has less flexibility to play things like bracket coverage on Keenan Allen to try to limit his effectiveness, especially off the line on third down. He's dominant consistently in those particular situations. Over his past 4 games, Keenan has caught 10 of his 13 targets on third down, and 7 of those have gone for first downs. So the Jags actually generally go man heavy on third downs. They play cover 1 on 58% of coverage snaps in their last 4 games. We might see a lot of Darius Williams or Trey Herndon traveling, and I think that there might be a lot of bracket coverage there too. Expect to see a lot of those latter 2 concepts. Last thing to watch for when the Chargers are on defense actually harkens back to when the Chargers did for the first time all season what no team had done to a Tua-led Dolphins team prior to the Chargers matchup, which is actually look like they can slow down that offense on a consistent basis. And how did they do that? If you remember, the Chargers actually jammed the Dolphins receivers aggressively at the line to try to make Tua make multiple level reads and fit the ball into places that he might not have expected to have to fit it in. I think the Chargers are actually going to have to try to do that to Trevor Lawrence, because if you remember, what happened in week 3 for the Jaguars, which was so effective, was they were able to get the ball out extremely quickly on hot read type of plays, quick plays off the line. And the Chargers want to limit Lawrence's ability to get large gains on early downs through those types of concepts. This week, Drew Tranquil talked about the importance of winning one-on-one matchups consistently, which the Chargers are going to have to do because Jacksonville has such good balance on offense, and they have over the last 5 games when they've been one of the best teams in terms of EPA value added per play on offense. The Chargers are going to have to win a lot of one-on-one matchups, especially early off the snap, and make Trevor Lawrence hold the ball a little bit longer than he wants to if they're going to have any sort of chance in this game. Staley likes to describe his role and his perspective on defensive play calling and defensive game plan like this. He says basically he has knobs like man coverage, blitzing, rushing for, etc. And he likes to turn those knobs up or down based on the opponent and what the opponent likes to do best and how Staley wants to counter that. From that perspective, it's very important to note that this week is a week where the Chargers might want to turn down the blitzing knob and the man coverage knob, because Lawrence, especially since week 9, has been brilliant against the blitz, and Staley wanted to blitz a lot. He turned that knob up in week 3. It didn't work. Lawrence destroyed it, and Staley, for whatever reason, continued to blitz throughout the game, and it completely backfired. Lawrence shredded the team in the second half despite their continued blitzing. So that's something that I would not even wander towards if I'm Staley this week. And they also need to stay away from man coverage, because Trevor Lawrence is exceedingly good against man coverage to the point that he leads the league. Not second, not third, not fourth, not seventh. He leads the league in expected points added per drop back against man coverage this year. If the Chargers do that, or do it too much, that is strategic suicide. They need to play as much zone coverage as they possibly can and ensure that they disguise it well enough that Lawrence can't get comfortable against any looks. And again, the more pressure they can generate out of those disguised looks, the better. When you look at the totality of the Chargers season, one of the most frustrating elements for sure is how much they've been held back by their lack of offensive creativity, which is kind of funny considering the level of talent they have at the most important offensive position on the field, and just the amount of talent they have overall. And this is a situation where, as someone who likes to talk about sports, commentate on sports all the time, I think it's very ubiquitous that people love to immediately call for people to be fired, especially coaches, etc. I'm on the other end of that spectrum. I think it's very important to not overreact to coaching performances and call every 2 weeks for one of them to be fired. I'll make an exception here, unfortunately, because I think we've seen enough as Chargers fans and just as NFL observers in general to know that Joe Lombardi is not a good offensive coordinator, or at least is not a good offensive coordinator for this specific personnel. His lack of aggression downfield, although understandable for part of the season because they were trying to protect the quarterback and not have him take too many hits after he fractured his rib cartilage. Herbert has been healthy now for a good number of weeks, and still the lack of aggression down the field has been a hallmark of Joe Lombardi's passing attack and game planning for the entirety of his tenure as offensive coordinator. He, regardless of the outcome of the Chargers' run this year, unless they were to make an AFC Championship game or a Super Bowl, something like that, he needs to be gone next year. Unfortunately, he's just not a fit with Herbert's skill set, and they leave offensive plays and yardage on the field every week. The Ringer's Ben Solak, who does a very, very good job breaking down film, did a video earlier this year where he talked about the Chargers' average depth of target, which means how far down the field the wide receivers run their routes and then get targeted. The problem is Herbert has an absolute cannon, maybe the most pure arm talent in the game today, and yet the Chargers don't push the ball downfield, even off play action. So that's something that I think the Chargers need to focus on this week specifically in terms of pushing the ball down the field, because number one, they can do it. They have the talent to do it, even if Mike Williams isn't in there. And two, they haven't put much of it on film because, again, it's been a lacking element in their offensive game plan all year, which does offer the opportunity to show the defense looks that they haven't seen all year. In other words, if the Chargers come out ultra aggressive, especially off play action, naked bootleg, stuff like that, they might be surprised. They might not necessarily be as prepared for it, and that's something the Chargers can take advantage of, especially early on. If the Chargers do that, look for success in that area. And just one more note in terms of individual players and who might affect the outcome of the game in a way that we might not expect. Jacksonville's defense has actually been brilliant, especially late in games. In situations where it looks like they might lose the game, including last week, their defense has forced incredibly important, seismically important turnovers to maybe turn losses into wins. And Trayvon Walker, I think, is a guy who you might want to pinpoint this week. He's a freak athlete. And as we see with pass rushers in the NFL, out of the chute as young players, they're often not that effective. They have some technique stuff they need to learn, but Trayvon Walker has gotten better by leaps and bounds down the stretch of this season. He's been a huge part of their defensive improvement and such a dangerous player alongside Khalil Mack and Joey Bosa. Those three guys, I think, have the potential to maybe create a turnover that could turn the tide of a close game. So look out for that, in addition to the obvious coaching and quarterback play that we discussed already. And I'm stating the obvious here, but the stakes are enormous this Saturday night for Brandon Staley, maybe more than any other coach or player on the field. My more extended thoughts on whether Staley should have rested his players and how that affects this game are posted in the description down below, but suffice it to say, it was a very controversial decision last week. It changes the offensive game plan and the face of the Chargers offense significantly. And if you look at the background context, there are two very high-profile head coaching candidates in Sean Payton and Jim Harbaugh. But if the Chargers don't win this game, especially if they're not competitive defensively in this game, this is a litmus test game for Staley. It's very possible he's coaching for his job. If the Chargers, again, given the fact that they do have some guys out still, J.C. Jackson was lost for the season, and Rashawn Slater, although he's not a defensive player, is a huge part of this team. But the fact remains, Staley at this point has enough talent, defensive personnel-wise. Derwin James, Joey Bosa's back, although he's not probably up to speed to the level that he'd like, is still there. Khalil Mack. All of these guys are ready to perform and healthy enough to make an impact. The personnel that Staley has at his fingertips, definitely enough to win this game. As a totality, the Chargers, I believe, are a shade more talented. And if Staley finds a way to lose this game, I think it will reflect quite badly on him and on Joe Lombardi as well, of course, as it definitely should. So after diving into the strategies from both teams' perspective a little bit more deeply, let's look at the overall macro picture in terms of who's going to win and how the game script might go, especially in terms of betting. Now, I think it's very important to note a lot of people, a lot of pundits, a lot of gambling experts are predicting this game to be a shootout. Now, I understand from the perspective of the amount of offensive talent on both teams, especially at the quarterback position, you can make that argument. However, I think that both these defenses are fast enough and have enough good personnel, and especially from the Chargers' point of view, have the potential to be coached strategically well enough that this game is very, very likely to go under. The number currently sits at 47.5, and I think that there's a great chance that one or both teams get shut down for long stretches by the other team's defense. And in terms of a winner, I think this game, more than any other game this weekend, is as clear a 50-50 as you're ever going to get. There are a bunch of ways that each team could find a path to victory, a bunch of scenarios that could play out victoriously for each side. So if you want the best value, again, a home dog, the Jaguars, a 2.5-point home dog, that's where the value lies. And there are two key things, I think, supporting that angle. One of them is that the Jaguars this season are 7-5 outright as an underdog, which is one win short of the most underdog wins in a season, regular season and postseason combined, in the Super Bowl era. What does that tell us? That tells us that Jacksonville this season has thrived in the underdog role. That means a motivational coach like Doug Peterson has done a very good job of preaching the nobody believes in us type of perspective and having his team focused when they're the underdog this season. And that's borne itself out in the results. The other thing is that Jacksonville, I think, even though they didn't look spectacular, especially offensively last week, their execution wasn't particularly crisp. I think a young team like that, having experienced the atmosphere of a must-win game last week in a win-and-in game against Tennessee, I think that will benefit them hugely. That experience, especially that recently for a young core, really might prove advantageous. Their game speed, I think, will be very on point to start the game. So if I were to bet a side, certainly it would be Jacksonville, because I see this game, again, as much of a 50-50 as you can possibly find. And if you're betting a spread, you always want to take the points in that scenario. But as a Chargers fan, as it's very obvious which side I'm going to be cheering for, hopefully the Chargers at least execute well, and if they win or lose, hopefully they don't lose specifically because of coaching issues or injuries or whatever. Worst of luck to Jacksonville, of course, but I do hope that we get the level of entertaining game that this promises to be on the surface. Enjoy the action, everybody. Stay safe.